Alright, today I'm going to be changing the knock sensor on my 2005 Honda Pilot. To do this, I'm just going to be requiring a metric socket set, some metric wrenches, a torque wrench, and a pair of pliers, as well as the wiring harness for the knock sensor and a new knock sensor itself. The reason I need to do this, it was throwing code P0325 as well as the VTM4 light. And if you've seen my last video, you'll notice that it was visually damaged, so it's clearly a knock sensor that needs to be replaced. The first thing I'm going to do is remove the negative battery terminal before I start any work, and after that I'm going to remove the air filter housing by removing the 4 bolts that are holding it in place. Once the bolts are off, I'm just going to pop it right out of there and move it out of the way. You can see the 4 bolts located on each of the corners as demonstrated. And then I'm going to continue loosening up the remainder of the air intake system. And I'm now going to start removing some of the electrical connectors from the throttle body as well as from the upper intake manifold. After that, I'm going to start removing some of the hoses that are also attached to both the upper intake manifold and the throttle body. There's a mounting bracket for an electrical connector on the back side of the upper intake manifold being secured by 2 bolts. I'm just going to pop those off just so those are out of the way and not affecting the removal of the upper intake manifold when it's time to pull that much larger piece off. Because we're going to be removing the entire upper intake manifold, it's vitally important that you get all of the vacuum tubing detached from the upper intake manifold before you try lifting it off the engine. Likewise, we're going to also remove a lot of the accessories and tubing from the throttle body. For the same reason, we're going to be detaching that, but because there's so much wire and tube on this thing, I find it sort of gets in the way. First thing we're going to do for the upper intake manifold is to remove the bolts that are holding the upper intake manifold cover down. And once those are free, we'll be able to remove the cover and get right down into the upper intake manifold and unfasten it from the engine. I find it useful to use something like a Ziploc bag to throw all the nuts and bolts in, and by labeling the bag you won't mess up anything and you'll be able to get those parts back in place easily. Now that the cover is off, you can see the actual bolts that are holding the upper intake manifold to the engine, and we're going to pop those off as well. Once they're free, I'm also going to take those and put them into a Ziploc bag. And I'm going to take off the throttle body bolts, just remove the throttle body from the intake manifold. Once that's done, that intake manifold will just pick straight up. Then you can see the gasket, the spacer plate then comes off, and then finally the second gasket. And I'm going to be careful with these because I'm actually going to reuse them because they're brand new from the engine build. There's 2 bolts that are holding in the fuel rail, and I'm actually going to leave the fuel rail system attached and just pop those 2 bolts out and lift the fuel rail out of the way. And it just pops straight up, a little bit of wiggle, and the fuel injectors will come out. Once that's out, the last thing we're going to do is remove the lower intake manifold, and that's held on by 5 bolts. 4 of them are pretty obvious, but there's one that is difficult to see, and when I put it back in, I'll show you the location of that 5th bolt and why it's so hard to see. The bolt that's the hardest to get in and out is actually the one on the passenger side of the vehicle. If you took off the power steering pump, it would be easier. And with the lower intake manifold removed, you can see the knock sensor located right here. For this removal, you need a 24mm deep socket and an extension. I don't have a half-inch either torque wrench or socket, so I'm just going to use a breaker bar, which removes it without any issue. And here's the obviously broken knock sensor, clearly damaged. So there's the old one and the new one together. And I'm going to start by screwing in the new knock sensor by hand, and then once it's seated, I'm going to use the, again, 24mm socket with the extension and in this case the breaker bar, just to make sure that it's in there securely. Now I'm going to remove the old wiring harness so that I can put in the new one, and I would highly recommend that you change the wiring harness if you're going to do this job. So you can see the new wiring harness, they've got some anti-rodent covering on it so that animals don't eat it, and it just plugs into the top. I'm not going to actually plug the whole thing in, I'm just going to leave it loose, and hopefully that'll prevent damage when I reassemble the rest of the engine. So here are the bolts on the lower intake manifold. That's the one that's very difficult to see, and I'm just going to lift the fuel rail up and slide the lower intake manifold underneath, and this allowed me to do the job without depressurizing the fuel system. And there's two engine studs that it slides on, and then everything else just sort of bolts down. So like I said, the hardest one to remove and install is actually the one on the passenger side, and not the one that is very difficult to see. And I'm just going to install them with the small socket with the lower intake manifold secure. I am now going to just hook up the rest of the wiring harness for the knock sensor. And now I will put the fuel injectors and fuel rail back in place and use the two bolts that I took out to reattach it to the lower intake manifold. Being very careful not to drop these bolts down to the top of the engine. Make sure that everything's moved out of the way, and it should slide right into place without any issue. And here's the tightening sequence for the upper intake manifold. And what I'm going to do first is put the intake manifold bolts in by hand. I'm going to go in the order that is recommended, and once I have them all sort of in there hand tight, I'm going to use a torque wrench. The torque spec on these is supposed to be 16 foot-pounds, and I'm going to do sort of several iterations, kind of using the recommended tightening sequence and just slowly tightening them using the torque wrench, not going straight to 16 foot-pounds on bolt 1 then 2, but rather gradually getting up to the 16 foot-pounds. And here's the tightening sequence for the manifold cover. Before I do any of the tightening, I'm going to put the gasket back in and then put the intake manifold cover back on the upper intake manifold. I'm going to do the exact same thing that I did for the upper intake manifold itself. I'm going to follow the tightening sequence, just going hand tight at first, and then once that is done, I'm going to use the torque wrench to bring each of the bolts to the correct torque specification. And the torque spec for the upper intake manifold cover is only 104 inch-pounds, so quite a bit less than the upper intake manifold itself. Once I've gotten everything in hand tight, I'm going to use the torque wrench to bring each of the bolts to the correct torque spec But again, I'm going to do it gradually, so I'll actually cycle through the recommended bolt tightening sequence 2 or 3 times in order to gradually bring the bolts up to the correct torque specification. Once the upper intake manifold is fully attached, it's time to put the throttle body back on. There's just 2 nuts on the top that secure it to the upper intake manifold, and on the bottom of the throttle body there's 2 bolts. And with the throttle body reattached, it's time to get all those vacuum hoses, coolant hoses, and electrical connectors attached to both the upper intake manifold and to the throttle body itself. This would be a good time to inspect all those vacuum hoses to ensure that you don't need to replace them and make sure they're still in good condition. To get this job done at the dealership, it's actually quite expensive. When I asked how many hours it would take them, they quoted me as 2.25 hours, and here in Edmonton the shop hours are $165 an hour. So just in labor to get this job done would be approximately $375 plus the parts and taxes to go to the dealership and have this job done. You're looking at about $500. I got it done, including buying the 24mm socket, for about $75, which is a very substantive savings. And some of the last things I'm going to be doing is making sure all the ducting is in place and securing the air filter cover back into the housing and reinstalling the negative battery terminal. And before starting the car, I'm going to make sure all the wires and tubing are secure. And fortunately for me, it starts with no issues, and it also cleared the engine code and BTM4 warning light that it was previously showing. This job took me about 3 hours to complete, and everything seems to be working fine. The last thing I'm going to do is check to ensure that the engine isn't giving any more codes and all the codes are clear. So again, it takes about 3 hours, but it'll save you about $400. Thanks for watching my video. Don't forget to like and subscribe.